There are stories whispered in the forgotten corners of the continent. Stories of men who are no longer quite men, of boys subjected to mutations that should have killed them, of warriors who walk between the human world and the monstrous. These are the tales of witches. But tonight, we speak of one witcher in particular, not the White Wolf, whose legend echoes across every tavern from Novigrad to Nilfgaard. No, tonight we descend into the memory of something older, something that has weathered more winters than the stones themselves. Tonight, we remember Vesemir, the oldest living witcher, the last master of Kaer Morhen, the man who trained legends and watched empires crumble, a survivor who saw his brothers slaughtered, his home desecrated, and still rose each spring to walk the path, a teacher who became a father to boys who had none, and ultimately a hero who gave his last breath to protect the future he would never see. This is not a tale of glory. It is a chronicle of endurance, of what it means to be the last of your kind, to carry the weight of centuries on shoulders that refuse to bend, and to face the darkness knowing you will never see the dawn. It is the story of Vesemir, and it begins in a time so distant that even the stones have forgotten the year. Chapter 1. Origins in Shadow. Imagine, if you will, the continent in the 11th century, an age when monsters were not legends but daily terrors, when entire villages could vanish overnight, when mothers clutched their children close and prayed to gods both old and new for protection that rarely came. Into this savage world, a child was born, a child who would become Vesemir. The exact year remains lost to history, swallowed by the passage of time like so many other details of that brutal era. What we know with certainty is that Vesemir was born sometime in the 11th century, early enough to witness the construction of Kaer Morhen itself, that ancient fortress carved into the mountains of Kaedwen. He was there when the first stones were laid, when the school of the wolf was nothing more than an ambitious dream in the minds of witches who believed they could create something lasting. But how Vesemir came to the witches remains a mystery shrouded in time. The specifics of his arrival at Kaer Morhen, whether through the law of surprise, parental surrender, or some other circumstance, have been lost to the centuries. What matters is that a boy arrived at that mountain fortress, and the witches took him in to train him in their deadly craft. There, in that mountain fortress where the wind howls like a wounded beast and snow falls 8 months of the year, young Vesemir began his training. His mentor was a witcher named Barmin, a master of the craft whose name has been nearly forgotten by history, but whose teachings would shape generations. Under Barmin's harsh tutelage, the boy learned to wield a blade, to recognize the signs of monsters, to brew potions that could save or kill, and above all, to endure. Because the witch's training was not merely difficult, it was designed to break children, to shatter everything soft within them and rebuild what remained into something harder, colder, more capable of facing the horrors that lurked in every shadow. Young witches-to-be were subjected to the trial of the grasses, a nightmarish alchemical process that flooded their bodies with mutagenic compounds. Most boys died screaming. Their small bodies simply could not withstand the transformation. But Vesemir survived. His body accepted the mutations. His heart continued beating through the fever and the pain. And when it was over, he was no longer entirely human. His eyes could see in darkness. His reflexes became inhumanly fast. Toxins that would kill a normal man barely slowed him. and his lifespan stretched beyond the natural limits of mortality, granting him decades upon decades to perfect his craft. Under Barmen's instruction, Vesemir became a witcher. Not just any witcher, but one who showed particular aptitude for swordplay. His skill with a blade was exceptional even among the School of the Wolf, whose members prided themselves on their technical precision. He learned the ancient techniques Barmen passed down, lessons that included everything from proper footwork to, oddly enough, snowball fighting, an exercise designed to teach focus and relaxation even in the midst of winter's fury. Years passed. Vesemir completed his training and became a full witcher of the Wolf School. He walked the path, taking contracts to slay monsters across the continent. He saved villages from drowners, protected merchants from griffins, lifted curses that had plagued noble families for generations. With each contract fulfilled, with each monster slain, his reputation grew. But Vesemir was destined for more than simply being another witcher on the path. Fate had carved a different role for him, one that would define the rest of his impossibly long life. He returned to Kaer Morhen not as a student, but as a teacher. He became the fortress's fencing instructor, responsible for training the next generation of young witchers in the deadly art of sword combat. This was no small responsibility. A witcher's blade was often the only thing standing between life and death, between a village saved and a village destroyed. Every movement had to be precise. Every strike had to be lethal. There was no room for error when facing monsters that could tear a man apart with a single swipe of their claws. Vesemir took to teaching with a stern hand. He was demanding, exacting, intolerant of laziness or sloppiness. But beneath that harsh exterior beat the heart of someone who genuinely cared about his students' survival. Every lesson he drilled into them, every punishment he administered when they failed to meet his standards, was born from the knowledge that any weakness, any hesitation, could mean their death on the path. He trained dozens, perhaps hundreds, of young witchers over the years. He watched boys become men, watched them ride out from Kaer Morhen each spring to face the world's horrors. Some returned each winter, others never came back, their lives ended by beasts or men or simple misfortune. Each loss carved another scar across Vesemir's heart, but he never stopped. He could not stop, because if he did not train them properly, even more would die. During these years, Kaer Morhen flourished. The fortress teemed with life, with witches returning from the path laden with coin and stories, with young boys undergoing their trials, with mages who maintained the laboratories where the mutations were performed. The School of the Wolf was one of the most respected witcher schools on the continent, known for producing professional, reliable monster hunters who honored their contracts and commanded fair prices for their dangerous work. Vesemir was part of something greater than himself. He belonged to a brotherhood, a family bound not by blood, but by shared purpose and mutual respect. He had his mentor Barmen, his fellow instructors like Varin, and countless brothers in arms who understood the burden they all carried. But nothing lasts forever, not even witches. And in the second half of the 12th century, specifically in the year 1194, everything Vesemir knew would be torn apart by hatred and fire. Chapter 2. The Pogrom. The seeds of Kaer Morhen's destruction were planted long before the mob arrived at its gates. Throughout the continent, attitudes toward witches had begun to shift. In the old days, These mutated monster hunters had been seen as necessary evils, unpleasant perhaps, but vital for keeping communities safe. Yet as time passed and monsters became less numerous, that necessity began to fade in the minds of common folk. Witches were mutants, after all, freaks, not quite human anymore. Propaganda spread like a plague. A pamphlet called Monstrum, or Description of the Witcher, circulated throughout Cadwin, filled with vile accusations about witches' practices and purposes. It painted them as criminals, as abductors of children, as practitioners of dark sorcery. The pamphlet twisted truths into lies and invented atrocities from whole cloth. But people believed it. They wanted to believe it, because it is always easier to hate what you do not understand than to acknowledge your debt to those who protect you. The anti-Witcher sentiment grew especially strong in the regions surrounding Kaer Morhen. Local populations looked at the mountain fortress with increasing suspicion and fear. Mages, who had their own complex relationship with witches, fanned these flames. Some were opportunists seeking profit. Others were zealots, convinced they were doing righteous work. And a few, perhaps, were simply caught up in the mob's fervor and made choices they would later regret. On a day in 1194, it all came to a head. A mob assembled, not just peasants with pitchforks and torches, though there were plenty of those. This mob was led by mages, powerful sorceresses and sorcerers who wielded magical forces that could shatter stone and boil blood. They had come with a purpose, with determination, with hatred burning in their hearts. They had come to end the school of the wolf. The attack was brutal and thorough. The mob stormed through Kaer Morhen's gates, overwhelming the witches through sheer numbers and magical might. The defenders fought with everything they had. These were not ordinary men, but supernaturally enhanced warriors, each worth a dozen normal soldiers. But they were caught off guard, unprepared for an assault of this scale and ferocity. One by one, the witches fell. Master swordsmen who had survived countless battles against monsters were cut down by peasants' blades or consumed by mages' fire. The young students, boys who had only just begun their training, were slaughtered without mercy. Even the mages who worked in Kaer Morhen's laboratories, the renegade wizards who had devoted their lives to perfecting the mutation process, were killed alongside the witches they served. When the massacre finally ended, 23 witches lay dead. 40 students, including children barely old enough to hold a sword, had been murdered. The laboratories were ransacked. The secrets of the mutations, carefully guarded and refined over generations, were lost or destroyed. And Kaer Morhen itself, the great fortress that had stood for centuries, was left a shattered, blood-soaked ruin. But there was one survivor, one witcher who, through chance or fate or simple stubborn refusal to die, lived through the pogrom. His name was Vesemir. The exact circumstances of his survival remain unclear, shrouded by conflicting accounts and the fog of memory. Some sources suggest Vesemir was not present at Kaer Morhen during the attack. He may have been out on the path, fulfilling some contract in a distant land, and returned only after the fires had cooled and the bodies had been counted. If true, this would make him one of the handful of witches who survived simply by not being there when death came calling. Other accounts paint a far more harrowing picture. These suggest Vesemir was present during the assault, fighting alongside his brothers, defending the keep with blade and sign until he was overwhelmed. The mob, believing him dead, left his body among the corpses of his fellow witches. But Vesemir was not dead. He woke surrounded by death, by the bodies of people he had known and trained and loved, and somehow found the strength to rise. The truth, lost to time, matters less than the outcome. What we know for certain is that Vesemir survived when so many others did not, and that survival would define the rest of his impossibly long life. In the aftermath of the pogrom, the authorities condemned the attack. They called it an isolated incident, an unfortunate overreaction, and assured everyone that such violence would not be tolerated. Some of the attackers even expressed regret, though how sincere that regret truly was remains questionable. But words and hollow apologies could not undo what had been done. The School of the Wolf had been crippled, perhaps permanently. Vesemir, now quite possibly the oldest living witcher from the pre-pogrom generation, found himself facing an impossible task. Kaer Morhen still stood, but it was a ghost of what it had been. Walls crumbled, halls echoed with absence, and worst of all, the knowledge necessary to create new witches had been lost. The mages who knew the secrets of the trial of the grasses were dead. Their notes were scattered or destroyed. The mutation process, already risky even when performed by experts, had become even more dangerous without their guidance. Nevertheless, Vesemir did not abandon Kaer Morhen. He could not. This place was his home, his history, his purpose. He took on the role of second in command to Grandmaster Wren, one of the few older witches who had also survived, and together they attempted to rebuild what remained of their order. But the School of the Wolf would never recover its former glory. The world had changed. The age of witches was ending, and everyone knew it. Chapter 3: Survival and Decline. The years following the pogrom were marked by a slow, grinding decline. Vesemir and the surviving witches of Kaer Morhen clung to their traditions, their training, their purpose, even as the world around them moved on. For a time, there was hope. Both the School of the Wolf and the School of the Cat received funding from Kaedweni monarchs. Student exchanges were organized between the two schools. Some of the older witches formed friendships across school lines. Vesemir himself developed a bond with Guxart, the Cat School's fencing master, a relationship that began with mutual suspicion but gradually transformed into genuine respect. Yet tensions simmered beneath the surface. The students from different schools often distrusted each other, leading to brawls and arguments. The Cat School witches had a reputation for being more emotional, more volatile than their Wolf School counterparts. Many cats resented the discipline and control that Wolf School training demanded, and some harbored darker ambitions. Everything came to a head during a tournament organized to showcase the skills of both schools. What should have been a friendly competition devolved into betrayal and bloodshed. Trice, the Cat School's grandmaster, had secretly conspired with King Radowit II and his court mage Astragarus. The king had grown paranoid about the witches, seeing their revival as a potential threat to his power. During the tournament, Trice and his conspirators ambushed the unsuspecting Wolf School witches. But Radowit's treachery ran deeper still. He had no intention of honoring his alliance with the cats either. When the ambush occurred, the king ordered his soldiers to shoot everyone, both wolves and cats alike. It was efficient, brutal and solved what Radowitz saw as two problems at once. He eliminated the witches he feared while also freeing himself from the financial burden of funding their schools. Vesemir and Guxard were arrested a week before the tournament, an act that inadvertently saved both their lives. They were spared from the massacre that claimed their respective grandmasters, Ren and Trice. Eventually, both were released and allowed to rebuild their schools, but with a critical condition: they would receive no more royal funding. The schools would operate independently or not at all. For the School of the Wolf, already crippled by the pogrom, this was a death sentence drawn out over decades. Without funding, without mages, without the ability to safely create new witches, the school slowly bled out. The last batch of children was trained at Kaer Morhen sometime in the 1230s. After that, no new witches were made. The mutation process had become too dangerous, too unpredictable. The knowledge required to perform it safely was gone, and even if they had the knowledge, they lacked anyone with the magical ability to oversee the trials. By the 1260s, Vesemir was the last of the old guard. Every other witcher who had lived through the pogrom had died on the path. He was the sole remaining link to Kaer Morhen's glory days, the only living memory of what the School of the Wolf had been before hatred and fire had broken it. Yet even in decline, Vesemir maintained the fortress as best he could. Each winter, a handful of witches would return to Kaer Morhen to wait out the cold months. There was Eskel, scarred and steady, one of the most skilled swordsmen the school had ever produced. There was Lambert, young and bitter and brilliant despite his anger. And occasionally, others would visit. Cohen, a witcher from another school, was welcomed, but cats and vipers were banned from the keep. Vesemir had not forgotten the betrayal, and he would not risk his home again. These witches became Vesemir's family, not by blood, but by choice. He had trained most of them, had watched them survive their trials, had taught them everything he knew about surviving in a world that hated them. They called him father, grandfather, old man, and he loved them with a fierceness that belied his stern demeanor. Chapter 4. Training the White Wolf. One day, they say, a sorceress named Visenna left a young boy in the forest near Kaer Morhen. Some accounts suggest she abandoned him in the valley just beyond the fortress, unable or unwilling to care for him herself. The witches found the child and brought him to their keep. His name was Geralt, and he became Vesemir's responsibility. Geralt was different from the beginning, but unlike most boys brought to Kaer Morhen, Geralt showed an unusual aptitude for the trials. His body accepted the mutations with less resistance than normal. The mages, desperate to improve the survival rate, subjected him to additional experimental mutagens. The extra mutations saved Geralt's life, but marked him forever. His hair turned white as snow. His skin became pale as death. Even among witches, who were already marked as different, Geralt stood out. He was called the White Wolf, Gwynblyde in the Elder Speech, and Vesemir became his primary guardian, his teacher, his father in all but blood. Training Geralt was not easy. The boy had a stubborn streak, a tendency to question authority that would serve him well in his later years, but caused considerable friction during his youth. Vesemir was a demanding instructor, intolerant of laziness or half measures. He drilled the sword forms into Geralt until they became second nature. He taught him to identify monsters by their signs, to brew potions that could mean the difference between life and death, to understand the politics of taking contracts. And when necessary, he disciplined the boy. There is a story recounted years later of young Geralt and Eskel playing around with a giant bumblebee during their training. Vesemir, upon discovering their foolishness, promptly produced a leather strap and whipped both boys for their incompetence. It was harsh, perhaps, but witches could not afford to be careless. A moment's inattention on the path could result in death. Yet beneath the harsh discipline, there was genuine love. Vesemir saw something special in Geralt, a potential that went beyond even his unusual mutations. He nurtured that potential while simultaneously working to keep the boy grounded, to prevent him from becoming arrogant or reckless. When Geralt struggled, Vesemir was there to guide him. When he succeeded, Vesemir allowed himself a rare moment of pride. The relationship between them became the template for Vesemir's interactions with all his students. He was never soft, never indulgent, but he was always present. He celebrated their victories and mourned their failures. And though he sent them out onto the path, knowing many would never return, he gave them the tools to survive in a hostile world. Eskel became another of Vesemir's particular successes. Quiet, competent, emotionally intelligent in ways many witches were not, Eskel was often considered Geralt's equal in skill, if not in fame. The two grew up as brothers, training together, getting into trouble together, forming a bond that would last their entire lives. Vesemir watched them grow, watched them complete their trials, watched them become the witches he had always hoped they would be. Slumber was different, younger and angrier, scarred by a childhood he rarely spoke about. He had a sharp tongue and a cynical worldview that sometimes grated against Vesemir's more traditional sensibilities. Yet Vesemir never gave up on him. He saw past Lambert's abrasiveness to the capable witcher beneath, and he made sure Lambert knew he was valued, even when the young man's attitude suggested otherwise. There were others over the years. Cohen, a witcher from the Griffin School, who wintered at Kaer Morhen and became part of their makeshift family. Berengar, whose story would end in tragedy. And of course, the boys who did not survive their trials, whose medallions Vesemir hung from a tree in remembrance. Vesemir kept one particularly dark memento from those days, the table on which young boys were subjected to the trial of the grasses. It sat in Kaer Morhen's laboratories, a constant reminder of what he considered the worst thing he had ever done in his life. Training boys to be witches meant subjecting them to mutations that killed more often than they succeeded. He had watched children die on that table, had seen them convulse and scream, and ultimately fall still. Every death weighed on him. Every loss was another scar. But what else could he do? The world needed witches, villages needed protection, and these boys, claimed by the law of surprise or brought to Kaer Morhen by desperate parents, deserved a chance to become something more than victims. So Vesemir continued year after year, training and teaching and grieving in equal measure. As the years passed and Geralt grew into a legendary witcher in his own right, their relationship evolved. Vesemir was no longer just a teacher, but a confidant, an advisor, someone Geralt could turn to when the world became too heavy. And when Geralt invoked the law of surprise and found himself with a child of destiny, when he brought a young girl named Cirilla to Kaer Morhen, Vesemir took on the role of mentor once again. But this time, everything would be different. Around the year 1265, Geralt of Rivia arrived at Kaer Morhen with a child in tow. Not a boy destined to become a witcher through trials and mutations, but a girl, a princess, no less. Cirilla Fiona, Ellen Rhiannon, granddaughter of Queen Calanthe of Cintra, survivor of Nilfgaard's brutal conquest, and Geralt's child surprise bound to him by the law of surprise. When Geralt introduced her, saying simply, "She's my destiny," Vesemir must have felt the weight of history pressing down upon him. In all the centuries of the School of the Wolf, they had never trained a girl. The mutations that created witches had only ever been performed on boys. Given the dangers involved and the lack of any precedent, subjecting a female child to the trial of the grasses would have been unthinkable. And even if they had been willing to try, they lacked the magical expertise to do so safely. But Ciri was special. She carried elder blood in her veins, an ancient genetic gift that granted her immense magical potential. She was also being hunted by powerful forces who wanted to use her for their own ends. Kaer Morhen, for all its decay, was one of the few places on the continent where she could be relatively safe. And so, despite all the complications, Vesemir accepted her. He took on the role of teacher once again, though this time he adapted his methods. Ciri could not become a true witcher, but she could learn the witcher's trade. Vesemir taught her about monsters, how to identify them by their behavior and signs, how to understand their weaknesses. He instructed her in herbs and potions, showing her which plants could heal and which could kill. And he told her stories, recounting the legends of past witches and the history of Kaer Morhen itself. The physical training, however, he left primarily to Geralt, Eskel, Lambert, and Cohen. These witches put Ciri through a brutal regimen designed to build her speed, strength, and reflexes. They taught her sword forms and footwork. They ran her ragged through the Killer, a treacherous mountain trail that young witches used to build endurance. And they pushed her to her limits, knowing that anything less would leave her vulnerable in the dangerous world beyond Kaer Morhen's walls. Vesemir's contribution was gentler, but no less important. He sewed her a tunic for training, though it proved less practical than he had hoped when it caused her injury during a run through the Killer. He made sure she ate properly and rested when needed, and he provided emotional support, becoming Uncle Vesemir to a girl who had lost everything else in her life. Their bond deepened over the winter. Ciri would often fall asleep during Vesemir's lectures about monsters, and she delighted in playing pranks on him when his age caught up with him and he dozed off himself. She saw in him not the stern instructor that terrified young Witcher trainees, but a kind, patient grandfather figure who genuinely cared about her well-being. But Ciri's presence at Kaer Morhen brought complications. During her training, she accidentally drank White Seagull, a powerful alchemical base used in Witcher potions. The substance triggered a trance, revealing that Ciri was a source, someone with immense but largely uncontrolled magical power. During her third trance, she prophesied the deaths of Geralt and Cohen, a vision that terrified everyone present. Vesemir made the decision to summon help. He sent for Triss Merigold, a sorceress he had known for years, under the pretense that his bones were aching and he needed magical assistance. It was a transparent excuse, but it worked. Triss arrived and immediately recognized both Ciri's potential and the witch's complete inability to properly care for a young girl. The sorceress imposed several conditions. The witches needed to pause Ciri's physical training during her menstruation. They needed to reduce the herbs they were giving her, as some promoted muscle growth in boys but had unpleasant side effects for girls. And they needed to acknowledge that they were raising a child, not just training another witcher. Vesemir, despite some initial protests from Slumber and others, accepted Triss's terms. He understood that Ciri deserved more than they could give her. His willingness to listen, to adapt, to put Ciri's needs above witcher tradition demonstrated how much he had grown over the centuries. Vesemir was not simply the strict instructor he had been in his youth. He had become a leader, someone capable of making difficult decisions for the greater good, someone who could balance tradition with compassion. When spring came and Geralt prepared to take Ciri to the Temple of Melitele in Elendor for a more conventional education, Vesemir gave his blessing. Ciri asked if Triss could stay longer, and Vesemir agreed, trusting the sorceress's judgment. He had learned, perhaps later in life than he should have, that sometimes the best way to protect someone was to let them go. That winter at Kaer Morhen would be one of Vesemir's fondest memories. Ciri brought life back to the old fortress, laughter to halls that had been silent for too long. She reminded him why witches existed in the first place, not to hunt monsters for coin, but to protect the innocent from darkness. And though he knew Ciri would face terrible dangers in the years ahead, he took comfort in knowing she would face them with the tools he had given her. But those years ahead would also bring trials Vesemir could never have anticipated. Ciri's destiny was intertwined with forces beyond mortal comprehension, and Vesemir's role in her story was far from over. Chapter 5. The Long Walk. But before we reach that final chapter, we must understand the decades that came before. The years between the last witches trained in the 1230s and Ciri's arrival in 1265. Decades during which Vesemir continued to do what he had always done: survive, endure, and walk the path. Each spring, as the snow melted and the mountain passes became traversable, Vesemir would leave Kaer Morhen. Despite his advancing age, he refused to retire. He would mount his horse and ride out into the world, seeking contracts, hunting monsters, earning the coin necessary to maintain what remained of the fortress. His reputation preceded him. Nobles and merchants, village elders and desperate farmers all knew that if you needed a monster slain and wanted someone reliable, Vesemir was your witcher. He had seen more creatures than perhaps any living person. He knew their habits, their weaknesses, their tells. When others spoke of monsters from legend, Vesemir could describe them from personal experience. There was the time he lifted a curse from a princess known as the Swan of Povis, a feat that became one of his most famous deeds. There was the incident at Fox Hollow, where he joined forces with a militia captain named Germain to drive off a horde of vampires led by none other than Emil Regis Rohelic Terziev Godefroy. Vesemir and Germain fought side by side, eventually forcing Regis and his companions to retreat. The higher vampire, impressed by Vesemir's courage and skill, later made a pact to leave the village in peace, respecting the old witch's determination to protect innocence. And then there was Mignol. In the winter of 1234, while fulfilling a contract in Oxenford, Vesemir met a young woman. They noticed each other from afar, and she sent him a letter through her governess inviting him to meet. They shared a brief but intense romance, a moment of warmth in Vesemir's long, cold life. But her father discovered the affair, furious that his daughter had become involved with a witcher, a mutant freak in his eyes. He chased Vesemir from their home and issued an arrest warrant. Vesemir fled, leaving behind his gambeson in his haste. That piece of armor, a reminder of the one romance he had dared to pursue, would remain in Mignol's possession for decades. The memory of that winter stayed with Vesemir, not with bitterness, but with a kind of melancholy acceptance. He had lived long enough to understand that witches were not meant for such happiness. They were meant for the path, for the endless cycle of riding from village to village, taking contracts, slaying beasts, and moving on before the locals' gratitude turned to suspicion. Romance, family, a normal life. These seemed like luxuries the profession could not accommodate. Yet Vesemir never became cynical. He had seen too much death, too much hatred, to let it poison him the way it had poisoned others. He maintained his professionalism, his courtesy, his fundamental decency, even when dealing with people who barely concealed their contempt for what he was. He honored his contracts, charged fair prices, and never took advantage of desperate clients the way some witches did. His combat skills remained formidable even in his advanced age. While younger witches might have superior reflexes or stamina, Vesemir had something they lacked: centuries of experience. He had fought every type of monster that walked, crawled, flew, or swam across the continent. He knew when to be aggressive and when to be patient. He understood that surviving a fight was more important than looking impressive during it. Other witches respected him for this. Eskel and Lambert might joke about his age, calling him old man and teasing him about his creaking joints, but they listened when he spoke. Geralt, despite becoming arguably the most famous witcher on the continent, still deferred to Vesemir's judgment on matters of monster lore and witcher tradition. And when younger witches from other schools crossed paths with Vesemir, they showed him the respect due to a living legend. But respect did not make the path any easier. Each year, Vesemir felt his age a little more acutely. His joints ached in the cold. His reflexes, while still superhuman, had slowed incrementally. He needed more time to recover from injuries, and there were fewer contracts available as monsters became increasingly rare and common folk increasingly hostile toward witches. Still, he persevered. What else could he do? Kaer Morhen needed maintaining. The small family of witches who returned each winter needed a place to call home, and Vesemir had never been one to quit. Simply because things became difficult, he had survived the pogrom, the betrayals, the slow death of his order. He would survive this too. During the winter months, when the witches gathered at Kaer Morhen, Vesemir settled into a different role. He cooked meals, maintained the fortress as best he could with limited resources, and enjoyed the company of the few people in the world he could truly call family. They would drink together, tell stories, practice their forms in the courtyard, and pretend, for a few short months, that they were not the last remnants of a dying breed. These moments of peace became increasingly precious. Vesemir understood, better than perhaps anyone, that their time was running out, not just for individual witches, but for the entire institution. No new witches were being made. Every death on the path was permanent, irreplaceable. Eventually, there would be no witches left at all. The thought should have filled him with despair. Instead, it filled him with determination. If the age of witches was ending, then he would make sure their final chapters were worthy of remembrance. He would train those who remained to be the best they could be. He would maintain their traditions and their honor. And he would face whatever came with the same steady courage that had carried him through 2 centuries of hardship. Little did he know that his greatest test still lay ahead, that his final winter would bring not peace but war, and that his death would mean more than all the years of his life combined. Chapter 6. The Amnesiac Wolf. The year 1270 brought Vesemir face to face with a mystery that would reshape the Witcher world. Geralt of Rivia had vanished. For years, no one had heard from the White Wolf. Rumors circulated. Some claimed he was dead, others that he had retired. Still others whispered darker possibilities. Vesemir searched, as did Triss Merigold, and others who cared about Geralt's fate. But the continent was vast, and even the most famous Witcher could disappear into it if circumstances conspired against him. Then finally, word reached Vesemir. Geralt had been found near Vesemir, unconscious and barely alive. A group of individuals had discovered him and were transporting him towards safety. Vesemir immediately set out to intercept them, riding hard through dangerous territory to reach his former student. When Vesemir finally found Geralt, relief ward with concern. The White Wolf lived, but something was profoundly wrong. Geralt had no memory of who he was, of his past, of the people he had known and loved. The amnesia was complete and seemingly irreversible. Vesemir examined him, asked careful questions, and came to a troubling conclusion. Geralt's memory might never fully return. Nevertheless, Vesemir did what he had always done. He adapted. If Geralt could not remember his training, Vesemir would train him again. If he had forgotten the signs and sword forms, Vesemir would teach them anew. They returned to Kaer Morhen together, to the fortress where Geralt had first learned to be a Witcher, and began the painstaking process of rebuilding what had been lost. That winter, Kaer Morhen hosted an unusual gathering. Eskel and Lambert were there, as always, but this year they had a new addition, a young man named Leo. He was not a Witcher, had never undergone the trials, but he had been taken in by the Witchers and trained in their ways. Leo was enthusiastic, eager to prove himself, desperate to be accepted as part of their brotherhood. Vesemir took Leo under his wing, much as he had once done with Geralt. He taught the young man everything he could, knowing that Leo would never be a true Witcher, but hoping he could at least survive on the path. There was a tenderness in how Vesemir treated Leo, a grandfatherly affection that he rarely showed. Perhaps he saw in Leo a chance to train one more student, to pass on his knowledge one more time before the end. The training that winter focused on reacquainting Geralt with the fundamentals. Vesemir drilled him in swordplay, starting with basic forms and gradually working up to more complex techniques. He taught him about potions and oils, about preparing for battles against specific types of monsters. He explained the signs Ard, Igni, Irden, Quen, Axi, and helped Geralt remember how to cast them. It was like turning back the clock, returning to the days when Geralt had been a boy learning these lessons for the first time. Except now, Geralt was a grown man, a legendary Witcher, with skills his body remembered even if his mind did not. The training progressed faster than it might have with a true novice, muscle memory filling in gaps that conscious thought could not bridge. But their winter of training was cut short by violence. A criminal organization called the Salamandra had learned of Kaer Morhen's location. They came seeking the witch's secrets, specifically the knowledge of how to create mutagens and perform mutations. Led by a mage known as the Professor and a warrior called Azar Javed, the Salamandra attacked the fortress with overwhelming force. The assault was swift and brutal. Armed bandits poured through Kaer Morhen's gates, and behind them came something worse: horrific mutant creatures, failed experiments that the Salamandra had created using stolen alchemical knowledge. The witches fought desperately to defend their home, but they were outnumbered and caught off guard. Vesemir fought with the fury of a man defending everything he had left. His blade sang through the air, cutting down bandits and mutants alike. Beside him, Geralt, Eskel, and Lambert fought with equal ferocity, and Leo, eager to prove himself, threw himself into battle alongside the witches who had become his family. The fighting was chaotic and vicious. The witches' superior skill kept them alive, but the sheer numbers of attackers threatened to overwhelm them. They fell back, defending the inner keep, trying to prevent the Salamandra from reaching the laboratories where the remaining mutation secrets were stored. And then, disaster struck. In the heat of battle, Leo found himself facing Azar Javed, a skilled and dangerous opponent, far beyond his abilities. Leo fought bravely, but he was not a witcher. He lacked the mutations that would have given him the speed and strength to match Javed. The battle was brief, and its outcome inevitable. Azar Javed's blade found Leo's throat. Blood sprayed across the ancient stones of Kaer Morhen. Leo fell, and by the time the other witches reached him, he was already dying. Vesemir cradled the young man in his arms, watching helplessly as life drained from Leo's eyes. All his centuries of experience, all his knowledge and skill, meant nothing in the face of this simple, brutal truth. People he trained kept dying. First, the boys who failed their trials. Then the students murdered during the pogrom. Now Leo, who had never even been given the chance to become a true witcher. The grief and rage Vesemir felt in that moment was profound. But there was no time to mourn. The Salamandra was still inside Kaer Morhen, still threatening everything he had spent his life protecting. Vesemir laid Leo's body down gently, rose to his feet, and returned to the battle with cold fury burning in his heart. Eventually, the witches prevailed. The Salamandra were driven out or killed. But the victory felt hollow. The attackers had stolen several witcher mutagens from the laboratories, substances that would allow them to create more of their twisted experiments. And Leo was dead, his potential unfulfilled. His dreams of walking the path ended before they truly began. In the aftermath, Vesemir stood in Kaer Morhen's courtyard, looking at the damage: broken gates, scorched walls, bloodstains that would never fully wash away, and a fresh grave dug in the cold earth, marking Leo's final resting place. The other witches gathered around Vesemir. Geralt, his memory still incomplete, but his sense of purpose clear. Eskel and Lambert, grim-faced and angry. Triss Merigold, who had arrived after the battle and could only apologize for being too late. Together, they made a decision. They would hunt down the Salamandra. They would recover the stolen mutagens, and they would avenge Leo. For Vesemir, this was personal. The Salamandra had violated Kaer Morhen, the last place sacred to the school of the wolf. They had killed a young man he had cared for deeply, and they had stolen knowledge that, in the wrong hands, could create horrors beyond imagination. This could not stand, would not stand. As the witches prepared to depart on their hunt, Vesemir felt the weight of his years more heavily than ever before. He was tired, so profoundly tired. But he had survived 2 centuries by being stubborn, and he was not about to stop. Now, Leo's death would not be meaningless. The boy would be remembered, and his killers would face justice. Chapter 7. The Wild Hunt rises. After the Salamandra crisis was resolved and Geralt had departed to rebuild his life, years passed in relative quiet. Vesemir returned to his routine of wintering at Kaer Morhen and taking contracts during warmer months. The fortress remained standing, though each year it crumbled a little more. The number of witches who returned each winter continued to dwindle, but life, such as it was, continued. Then, in 1272, everything changed. Yennefer of Vengerberg had disappeared. The sorceress who had been Geralt's lover, his partner, his equal in every way that mattered, had vanished without a trace. Geralt, desperate to find her, searched everywhere. He enlisted help from friends and allies across the continent, and he turned to the one person he trusted above all others, Vesemir. Together, Geralt and Vesemir embarked on a quest to locate Yennefer. They followed leads from Vesemir to White Orchard, searching for any sign of the missing sorceress. Along the way, they encountered the horrors that were spreading across the continent like a plague: the Wild Hunt. The Wild Hunt was not new. Legends of spectral riders who appeared during storms, kidnapping people and leaving death in their wake, had existed for centuries. But those legends had taken on terrifying new reality. The hunt was active, aggressive, and seemingly unstoppable. Entire villages were being destroyed, people were vanishing in the night, and everywhere the hunt passed, they left behind a cold so intense it froze blood in veins and turned living flesh to ice. Vesemir had lived long enough to have heard every monster legend on the continent. He knew the difference between folklore and truth, and he recognized immediately that the Wild Hunt represented a threat unlike anything he had faced before. These were not mindless beasts to be slain with silver swords and clever tactics. They were intelligent, organized, and possessed power that made even witches seem insignificant by comparison. The search for Yennefer eventually led them to information about Ciri. The young woman Vesemir had helped train decades ago was being hunted by the Wild Hunt. They wanted her for her elder blood, for the power that ran through her veins, and if the hunt captured her, the consequences would be catastrophic not just for Ciri, but for the entire world. Geralt and Vesemir's paths diverged as the search intensified. Geralt pursued leads across the war-torn landscape of the northern kingdoms, while Vesemir returned to Kaer Morhen to prepare for what seemed increasingly inevitable: a final confrontation. If the Wild Hunt wanted Ciri, and Ciri would eventually need sanctuary, she would come to Kaer Morhen. It was the only place left where she might be safe. Vesemir spent the following months fortifying the old fortress as best he could. He repaired walls that had stood broken for decades. He stockpiled weapons and alchemical supplies. He prepared traps and defensive positions. And he sent word to everyone he trusted: warriors, sorceresses, and witches from across the continent. If they were willing to fight, Kaer Morhen would welcome them. The responses were mixed. Some ignored the call, unwilling to risk their lives for a cause that seemed hopeless. Others came immediately, driven by loyalty or friendship or simple decency. Slowly, a small army assembled at Kaer Morhen. Eskel and Lambert, of course, Triss Merigold, who had helped train Ciri years ago, Kira Metz, another sorceress whose expertise with magic would be invaluable, Vernon Roche and Vez from the Blue Stripes, Zoltan Chivai, the dwarf who'd been Geralt's friend through countless adventures, even Letho of Gullid, a Viper School witcher with his own complicated history, answered the call. And finally, Geralt returned with Ciri at his side. Vesemir's reunion with Ciri was deeply emotional. The last time he had seen her, she'd been a child, eager and energetic and full of questions. Now she was a young woman, hardened by years on the run, scarred by experiences that would have broken most people. But when she saw Vesemir, some of that childhood joy returned. She called him Uncle Vesemir, as she always had, and embraced him with genuine affection. For Vesemir, seeing Ciri again was bittersweet. He was proud of what she had become, of her strength and resilience. But he also understood the terrible burden she carried. The Wild Hunt would not stop hunting her. Eventually, they would find Kaer Morhen, and when they did, the fortress would become a battleground. The days before the battle were spent in preparation. Ciri trained in the courtyard, practicing the skills she had learned years ago and developing new abilities that terrified and amazed those who witnessed them. She could teleport short distances in a blink, moving faster than even Witcher eyes could follow. She could unleash devastating blasts of energy. Her power had grown exponentially, but so had the danger surrounding her. Vesemir watched her practice with mixed feelings. Pride, certainly. Fear, absolutely. And underneath it all, a deep sadness born from knowing what was coming. He had lived through one massacre at Kaer Morhen. He understood what another would look like, but he did not share these fears with Ciri or the others. Instead, he focused on the practical. He taught Ciri how to make bombs and potions, skills she had learned as a child, but needed to refresh. He shared stories about the old days, about witches long dead and battles long won, trying to maintain morale in the face of approaching doom. And he made sure everyone understood the fortress's layout, the defensive positions they would hold, the signals they would use during the fight. When someone asked if they could truly defeat the Wild Hunt, Vesemir gave an honest answer. Probably not. The hunt was too powerful, too numerous, too skilled, but they did not need to defeat the entire hunt. They only needed to survive long enough to drive them back, to convince the hunt that taking Ciri was not worth the cost. It was a slim hope, but it was the only hope they had. As the days passed and the inevitable approached, Vesemir found himself reflecting on his long life. 200 years he had walked the continent, 200 years of battles and contracts and losses. He had trained generations of witches. He had watched his brothers die. He had maintained Kaer Morhen through sheer stubborn will when anyone else would have abandoned it. And now, at the end, he found himself surrounded by the closest thing to family he had ever known. Geralt, the son he had raised, Ciri, the granddaughter of his heart, Eskel and Lambert, the younger witches who represented everything good about the path, and a motley collection of warriors and mages who'd chosen to stand with them against impossible odds, if this was to be his final battle. At least he would face it alongside people worth dying for. The wild hunt was coming, and Vesemir would be ready. Chapter 8. The Battle of Kaer Morhen. The day the wild hunt arrived at Kaer Morhen dawned cold and clear. Too clear. There was an unnatural stillness in the air, a sense of anticipation that made even the most experienced warriors nervous. Vesemir stood on the fortress's walls, looking out at the valley below. Beside him, Geralt maintained a tense silence. Around them, the defenders took their positions. Sorceresses prepared their spells. Warriors checked their weapons one final time. And in the courtyard, Ciri practiced her sword work, burning off nervous energy. The hunt did not announce their arrival with trumpets or challenges. They simply appeared, materializing from thin air as if reality itself had been torn open. Spectral riders on skeletal horses emerged from portals of frost and death. Leading them was Eredin, the king of the wild hunt, and his generals, Caranthir, a mage whose power over ice was terrifying to behold, and Imlerith, a warrior of immense strength and cruelty. Behind the generals came the hunt soldiers, the Red Riders, warriors who had been transformed into something no longer human. And beyond them, in the gaps between worlds, lurked the hunt's true power, an entire army waiting to flood through if given the chance. The battle began with devastating speed. The hunt's first wave crashed against Kaer Morhen's outer defenses like a tsunami of frost and steel. Vesemir and the other defenders fought with desperate intensity, knowing that every second they held the walls was another second for Ciri to escape if necessary. But the defenders were not helpless. Triss and Kira unleashed destructive spells that shattered hunt warriors and temporarily sealed portals. Lambert and Eskel fought with the skill of master witches, their silver swords finding gaps in spectral armor. And Vesemir himself moved through the battle like a force of nature, his centuries of experience translating into economy of motion that younger warriors could only envy. For a time, it seemed they might actually hold. The defenders' coordination was excellent. The traps Vesemir had prepared slowed the hunt's advance, and Ciri's power, when she unleashed it, drove back entire groups of attackers. But the wild hunt was relentless. They did not tire. They did not retreat. They simply kept coming, wave after wave, testing the defenders' endurance. Slowly, inevitably, Kaer Morhen's defenders were pushed back from the walls to the courtyard, from the courtyard to the keep itself. Casualties mounted. Warriors fell, wounded or killed by the hunt's weapons. Mages exhausted themselves, maintaining protective barriers. Even the witches, for all their supernatural endurance, began to slow under the sustained assault. And then, Caranthir unleashed his full power. The hunt's mage created a massive ice construct, a golem of frozen death that smashed through the inner gates. The defenders rallied, focusing their attacks on this new threat, and eventually destroyed it. But the distraction had served its purpose. While the defenders were occupied, more hunt warriors poured into the fortress. The battle descended into chaos. Individual duels erupted throughout Kaer Morhen's halls and courtyards. Ciri found herself separated from the main group, fighting her way through hunt warriors. Geralt pursued her, trying to provide support, and the other defenders struggled to maintain cohesion as the battle fragmented. It was during this chaos that Vesemir made his choice. He saw Ciri surrounded by hunt warriors, fighting with incredible skill, but clearly being overwhelmed by sheer numbers. He saw Imlerith, the hunt's brutal general, moving to intercept her. and he understood in that instant what was about to happen. Ciri was exhausted, pushed to her limits. If Imlerith reached her, the battle would end. The hunt would capture her. Everything they had fought for would be lost. Vesemir did not hesitate. He charged into the fray, his blade cutting down hunt warriors as he carved a path to Ciri's side. He reached her, just as Imlerith closed in, putting himself between the young woman he loved like a granddaughter and the monster who wanted to enslave her. "Run!" Vesemir shouted at Ciri. "Get out of here!" But Ciri wouldn't abandon him. She had lost too many people already. She fought beside Vesemir, the two of them forming a desperate partnership against impossible odds. For a few precious moments, they held the line. Vesemir's experience and Ciri's raw power complemented each other perfectly. Hunt warriors fell before them. Then Imlerith struck. The general's mace came down with devastating force. Vesemir managed to deflect the first blow, but the sheer power behind it drove him to his knees. He tried to rise, to bring his sword up for a counterattack, but Imlerith was too fast, too strong. The general grabbed Vesemir by the throat, lifting the old witcher off the ground with one hand. Vesemir struggled, striking at Imlerith with his sword, but the blade could not penetrate the general's armor. He kicked, tried to break free, but Imlerith's grip was unyielding. Around them, the battle continued, but in that moment, nothing else mattered. Just an old witcher and the monster that was killing him. Ciri screamed. She tried to reach Vesemir, but other hunt warriors blocked her path. She could only watch, helpless, as Imlerith tightened his grip. In his final moments, Vesemir did not think about his long life, about the battles he had won or the students he had trained. His thoughts were for Ciri, about keeping her safe, about giving her one last chance to escape. And perhaps, after 2 centuries of surviving when others died, he was finally going to rest. Imlerith's mace came down one last time, and Vesemir's world went dark. His body fell to the ground, lifeless. The oldest living witcher, the last master of Kaer Morhen, the man who had endured the pogrom and trained Geralt and mentored Ciri, was dead. But his sacrifice was not in vain. Ciri's scream of grief and rage transformed into something else entirely. The elder blood within her erupted in response to Vesemir's death, unleashing power that had been dormant until that moment. A shockwave of pure energy exploded from her body, throwing back the hunt warriors, shattering portals, and forcing even Eredin to retreat. The Wild Hunt, faced with this display of uncontrolled power, made a tactical decision. They withdrew, pulling back through their portals to regroup. The Battle of Kaer Morhen was over. The defenders had survived, but the cost had been devastating. Geralt reached Vesemir's body moments after Imlerith killed him. The White Wolf knelt beside his mentor, his father in all but blood, and for once, the emotionless witcher facade cracked completely. Geralt's grief was raw and profound. He had lost Vesemir, the man who had trained him, guided him, been there for him through every crisis of his long life. Gone. Ciri knelt on the other side of Vesemir's body, tears streaming down her face. She blamed herself. If she had been faster, stronger, more controlled, Vesemir would not have needed to protect her. He would still be alive. The other defenders gathered around, forming a circle of respect. Eskel and Lambert, their faces grim. Triss weeping openly. Zoltan removing his hat. Every person present understood what had been lost. Not just a skilled fighter or an experienced witcher, but a living connection to the past, a repository of knowledge and wisdom that could never be replaced. A good man who had devoted his entire life to protecting others. They burned Vesemir's body on a funeral pyre, as was the Witcher tradition. As the flames consumed him, Ciri spoke a few words, her voice breaking. She thanked him for everything he had taught her, for the kindness he had shown when she needed it most, for the love he had given freely. She promised to remember him always, and then they raised a glass in his honor, drinking to the old Witcher who had finally found peace. Chapter 9. Legacy and Echoes. In the days following the Battle of Kaer Morhen, as the survivors tended their wounds and mourned their dead, the true measure of Vesemir's impact became clear. Geralt, processing his grief, realized that almost everything he knew about being a Witcher had come from Vesemir. Every sword form, every potion recipe, every lesson about honor and professionalism, they all trace back to the old man. Vesemir had shaped Geralt into the legendary White Wolf, not through harsh discipline alone, but through example. He had shown Geralt what it meant to endure, to maintain one's principles even when the world offered nothing but hostility, to protect the innocent even when the innocent showed no gratitude. Eskel and Lambert shared their own memories. Lambert, despite his cynical exterior, admitted that Vesemir had been the closest thing to a father he had ever known. The old Witcher had never given up on him, even when Lambert's anger and bitterness made him difficult to love. Eskel, more quietly, acknowledged that Vesemir's patient teaching had given him the skills to survive on the path, and more importantly, the wisdom to find satisfaction in a life that offered little comfort. And Ciri, perhaps more than anyone, carried Vesemir's legacy forward. The training he had given her, both in practical skills and in emotional resilience, served her well in the trials that followed. When she faced Eredin in their final confrontation, when she stood against the White Frost itself, she drew on the strength Vesemir had helped her cultivate. Uncle Vesemir was with her in spirit, his lessons echoing in her mind, giving her courage when courage seemed impossible. The defenders erected a cenotaph in Kaer Morhen's courtyard, a memorial to Vesemir and all the Witchers who had died defending the fortress over the centuries. It was a simple monument, fitting for a man who had never sought glory or recognition. The inscription read simply, "Here stood Vesemir, Master Witcher of the School of the Wolf." But Vesemir's true memorial was not stone or words. It was the continued existence of Witcher traditions, preserved because he had refused to let them die. It was the knowledge he had passed down to his students, ensuring that future generations would benefit from centuries of hard-won experience. It was the lives he had saved, directly through his contracts and indirectly through the witches he had trained. In the years following his death, stories about Vesemir circulated among the few remaining witches. They spoke of his skill with a blade, his encyclopedic knowledge of monsters, his patient teaching style. They told of how he had survived the pogrom when so many others died, how he had maintained Kaer Morhen through sheer determination, how he had given his life to protect Ciri without hesitation. Some stories were certainly exaggerated, others were likely understated, but all of them agreed on the essential truth. Vesemir had been a good man in a profession that often attracted the desperate and the ruthless. He had maintained his humanity despite the mutations, his compassion despite the losses, his hope despite overwhelming evidence that the age of witches was ending. And perhaps most importantly, he had understood what so many others missed, that being a witcher was not about the mutations or the silver swords or the superhuman abilities. It was about standing between the innocent and the darkness, about facing horrors that would break ordinary people, about doing what was necessary even when no one would thank you for it. These lessons lived on in every witcher Vesemir had trained. They were his true legacy, more lasting than any monument, more valuable than any amount of coin. As years passed after Vesemir's death, his presence in the lives of surviving witches shifted from acute loss to chronic absence. The sharp pain of grief dulled into persistent ache, always present but no longer overwhelming. They learned to live with the hole he left, to function around it, to find meaning in what remained rather than what was lost. Geralt, in particular, found himself unconsciously adopting Vesemir's mannerisms, the way he corrected younger fighters' stances, the particular tone of voice he used when explaining monster weaknesses, the habit of checking and rechecking equipment before contracts. These inherited behaviors were not deliberate imitation, but natural transmission, the way children absorb parents' patterns without conscious effort. Geralt had become, in some ways, the thing Vesemir had been training him to be all along: a teacher, a preserver of tradition, a link in the chain connecting past to future. Ciri's relationship with Vesemir's memory evolved as she matured. The guilt she initially felt over his death gradually transformed into determination to make his sacrifice meaningful. She became the person he had believed she could be, not through obligation but through recognition that his faith in her deserved vindication. When she faced the white frost, when she made choices that would determine the world's fate, she drew strength from knowing that Uncle Vesemir had thought her capable of such things. Years later, when Ciri had adventures of her own, she found herself offering advice to younger people that echoed Vesemir's teachings. She did not quote him directly or even consciously recall specific lessons, but his influence had shaped her understanding of courage, responsibility, and sacrifice in ways that emerged naturally when others needed guidance. She had become another link in the chain, passing forward wisdom that originated with someone she would never see again. Lambert's evolution was more subtle but equally significant. His anger, always a defining characteristic, became tempered with perspective that resembled Vesemir's pragmatism. He still raged against injustice and stupidity, but he chose his battles more carefully, conserved his energy for fights that mattered. When younger witches sought his counsel, which happened more often as his own experience accumulated, he found himself offering advice that sounded suspiciously like things Vesemir had told him decades ago. He had resisted those lessons at the time, but they had taken root anyway, growing slowly until they bore unexpected fruit. Eskel, perhaps, maintained the most conscious connection to Vesemir's memory. He deliberately preserved the old master's methods, maintaining Kaer Morhen according to standards Vesemir had established, training any witches who passed through using techniques Vesemir had taught. This dedication was not mere nostalgia, but recognition that the accumulated wisdom of centuries should not be discarded casually. If the Wolf School had any future, it would be built on foundations Vesemir had maintained when everyone else had given up. After Vesemir's death, Kaer Morhen changed. The fortress remained physically intact, its walls still standing against mountain winds, its halls still echoing with phantom footsteps. But something essential had departed with Vesemir, something that could never be replaced. The surviving witches felt his absence most acutely during the winter months when they returned to the keep. The routines they had followed for decades felt hollow without him. No one was there to greet them at the gates with gruff affection and pointed observations about how thin they looked or how poorly they had been maintaining their equipment. No one stood in the courtyard overseeing practice sessions, correcting stances with patient precision. No one cooked the meals they had eaten every winter since childhood, simple but nourishing food that carried the comfort of familiarity. The tree of lost medallions, where Vesemir had hung the wolf school medallions of witches who died, gained a new significance. Someone, probably Eskel, added a medallion representing Vesemir himself, though his actual medallion had been destroyed with his body on the funeral pyre. It was a symbolic gesture, acknowledging him among the fallen, ensuring he would be remembered alongside all the other witches who had called Kaer Morhen home. The physical reminders of Vesemir throughout Kaer Morhen made his absence more painful. His room remained largely untouched, his belongings still arranged as he had left them. His tools sat in the workshop, waiting for hands that would never again use them. His favorite chair near the fire seemed empty even when someone else sat in it. The fortress was haunted not by ghosts, but by memories, by the persistent echo of a presence that had defined the place for so long. The fortress itself, without Vesemir's constant maintenance, began to deteriorate more rapidly. Small problems that he would have fixed immediately went unaddressed. Systems he had kept running through sheer stubborn will started to fail. The building aged years in months, as if it too mourned the loss of the person who had cared for it longest. Kaer Morhen was dying, and everyone who saw it understood that they were witnessing the end of an era. Chapter 10. The Last Master. And so, dreamer, we come to the end of our tale. We have walked through 2 centuries of history, following one man's journey from boy to legendary master who gave his life for the future. We have seen Vesemir train generations of witches, survive massacres, maintain traditions, adapt to changes, love deeply, lose profoundly, and ultimately sacrifice everything for someone he cherished. What can we conclude about such a life? What meaning can we extract from this chronicle of endurance and sacrifice? Perhaps the most important lesson is that significance accumulates through sustained effort rather than spectacular achievement. Vesemir never slew a dragon single-handedly or saved a kingdom from supernatural threat. He did something more difficult. He kept going when giving up would have been easier, maintained standards when standards seemed pointless, cared for others when caring brought only pain. These daily choices, repeated across decades and centuries, created impact that exceeded any individual heroic deed. His life also illustrates that family can be chosen rather than inherited. Vesemir had no biological children, underwent mutations specifically designed to make reproduction impossible. Yet he was father to Geralt, grandfather to Ciri, uncle to countless witches who needed someone to believe in them. These relationships were as real as any created through blood, perhaps more so because they were sustained through deliberate choice rather than biological imperative. The manner of his death reinforces that how we exit life matters as much as how we live it. Vesemir could have died in bed, old and comfortable, having earned peaceful rest. Instead, he died protecting someone he loved, ensuring that his final act was consistent with every value he had maintained throughout his long life. That consistency, that refusal to compromise principles even when facing death, transformed his ending from tragedy into triumph. His legacy reminds us that teachers live on through students, that knowledge transmitted becomes immortality of sorts. Every witcher Vesemir trained carried part of him forward, preserving and adapting his wisdom for new circumstances. Every technique he taught continued to save lives long after his death. Every value he embodied influenced choices made by people who never knew him personally. This diffuse immortality, scattered across multiple lives and generations, was more lasting than any monument. The story of Vesemir also speaks to the bittersweet nature of being the last. He was final keeper of knowledge that would die with him, last witness to events no one else remembered, sole surviving link to a vanished world. This position gave him unique authority, but also profound loneliness. He carried the weight of memory without the comfort of shared remembrance. And when he died, something irreplaceable departed with him, a loss that could be mourned but never remedied. Yet even in ending, even in loss, there was beauty. Vesemir lived fully, loved deeply, and died meaningfully. He saw wonders that no living person would ever see again. He trained legends and shaped history. He maintained traditions that might otherwise have been lost. And in his final moments, he demonstrated that 200 years of life had not diminished his capacity for courage or sacrifice. He remained himself until the very end, stubborn and strong and steadfast. For those who survived him, his death was permission to continue, to adapt, to create something new from what remained. They could honor his memory without being trapped by it, could preserve his teachings while developing their own approaches, could acknowledge his importance while recognizing that the world had changed and they must change with it. His passing was an ending, but endings create space for beginnings. Kaer Morhen stands still, though perhaps not for much longer. The walls that Vesemir maintained for centuries continued to crumble. The halls where he trained warriors echo with emptiness. The courtyard where he oversaw practice sessions hosts no new students. The fortress is dying, and everyone knows it. But while it stands, it remains testament to his dedication, physical embodiment of the principle that some things are worth preserving even when preservation seems impossible. When the last Witcher leaves Kaer Morhen for the final time, when the fortress crumbles entirely and nature reclaims the mountain, Vesemir's memory will persist in other ways, in the techniques witches use, in the stories they tell, in the values they embody, in the choices they make when faced with darkness. He will be there, invisible but present, influencing events through chains of causation too complex to fully trace. Consider what it means to live a life of purpose in a world that no longer wants you. Vesemir watched his profession become obsolete, his skills deemed unnecessary, his very existence treated as an unwelcome reminder of a barbaric past. He could have become bitter. He could have retreated into nostalgia, clinging to memories of better days while refusing to engage with the present. He could have given up entirely, abandoned Kaer Morhen to ruin, and lived out his remaining years in comfortable obscurity. He did none of these things. Instead, he adapted without compromising. He maintained traditions while acknowledging that some needed to evolve. He trained students, knowing they would face a world very different from the one he had known, and he gave them tools flexible enough to apply to changing circumstances. He understood that preservation is not about keeping things frozen in amber, but about passing forward the essence of what matters so it can take new forms in new contexts. This wisdom, born from 2 centuries of witnessing change, made Vesemir more than just a skilled fighter or knowledgeable teacher. It made him a bridge between past and future, someone who could honor what came before while preparing for what came next. He was simultaneously the guardian of tradition and the enabler of progress, roles that might seem contradictory, but that he balanced with practiced ease. His relationship with authority reveals another facet of his character worth examining. Vesemir had been second in command at Kaer Morhen, subordinate to various grandmasters over the years, yet he never seemed diminished by this position. He led through competence and earned respect rather than formal title. When grandmasters died and were not replaced, when the hierarchical structure of the Wolf School essentially collapsed, Vesemir continued doing what needed to be done without requiring official authority to validate his actions. This comfort with informal leadership served him well in his final years. He could coordinate the defense of Kaer Morhen, bringing together witches, sorceresses, and warriors from diverse backgrounds without needing to assert dominance or demand obedience. People followed him because they trusted his judgment, not because he commanded them to. It was leadership through service rather than authority, a style that fit both his personality and the circumstances. The weight of knowledge he carried also deserves deeper consideration. Vesemir knew things that would die with him, and he knew that he knew them. This awareness must have been simultaneously empowering and terrifying. On one hand, it made him invaluable, the repository of information that existed nowhere else. On the other hand, it meant that every time he forgot something or failed to pass on some detail, irreplaceable wisdom was lost forever. How does one live without that responsibility? How does one prioritize which knowledge to preserve when time is limited and students are few? Vesemir made these choices constantly, consciously or unconsciously, determining what future witches would know and what they would lose. Some of his decisions were undoubtedly pragmatic, focusing on immediately useful information over historical trivia. Others may have been influenced by personal preference or forgotten in the chaos of daily survival. But what matters is that he tried. He did not hoard knowledge out of ego or protect secrets out of paranoia. He shared everything he could with everyone who would listen. His legacy includes not just the specific facts he passed down, but the principle that knowledge should flow forward, that each generation has an obligation to equip the next with the tools they will need. The practical skills Vesemir maintained also tell us something about his character. He was not above manual labor, not too proud to cook meals or repair walls or perform other mundane tasks necessary for survival. Some might see this as evidence of his humble nature, and there is truth to that interpretation. But it also reflects pragmatic understanding that if he did not do these things, they would not get done. He was often the only person at Kaer Morhen during certain periods, which meant he had to be cook, carpenter, armorer, and teacher all at once. This versatility served him throughout his life. When contracts dried up, he could take on different work to earn coin. When equipment broke, he could repair it himself, rather than depending on scarce and expensive craftsmen. When younger witches needed instruction in areas beyond combat, he could provide it. He was not a specialist narrowly focused on one aspect of witcher work, but a generalist capable of handling whatever situations arose. Yet despite this competence across multiple domains, Vesemir never claimed to know everything. He was willing to defer to experts in their areas of expertise, to learn from sorceresses about magic, from craftsmen about their trades, from younger witchers about innovations they had developed. This intellectual humility, rare in someone with his experience and accomplishments, kept him relevant even as the world changed around him. The emotional intelligence he demonstrated, particularly in his later years, was equally remarkable. Vesemir understood people in ways that went beyond surface observation. He could read students' emotional states, identify what they needed, whether that was encouragement or discipline, and adjust his approach accordingly. He recognized when Ciri needed gentleness rather than the harsh treatment given to young boys preparing for mutations. He understood that Lambert's anger masked pain and met it with steady patience rather than confrontation. This sensitivity suggests that Vesemir had processed his own emotions rather than simply suppressing them. He had grieved his losses, faced his fears, acknowledged his regrets. The emotional work he had done on himself enabled him to help others through their own struggles. He could not have been effective as a surrogate father to damaged young witches if he had not dealt with his own damage first. The romance with Mignol, brief though it was, hints at depths to Vesemir's emotional life that often went unacknowledged. He was capable of romantic love, of imagining a life beyond monster hunting, of wanting connection that went deeper than brotherhood or mentorship. The fact that this romance ended badly did not erase its importance. It proved that Vesemir had not become so hardened by his profession that he was incapable of vulnerability, that he kept Mignol's father's gambeson for decades afterward speaks volumes. It was a tangible reminder of what might have been, of the life he could have lived if circumstances had been different. Some might interpret keeping it as living in the past, unable to move forward. But it seems more likely that Vesemir kept it as acknowledgement of an important experience, a moment when he had been fully human rather than primarily a witcher. The intersection of Vesemir's personal desires with his professional obligations raises interesting questions about sacrifice and duty. How much of himself did he give up to maintain Kaer Morhen? What other relationships might he have pursued if he had not felt obligated to return to the fortress each winter? What experiences did he miss because he prioritized training students over his own fulfillment? These are unanswerable questions, but they are worth asking because they remind us that Vesemir's dedication came at personal cost. He was not a saint immune to loneliness or desire. He was a person who chose duty over comfort, who repeatedly sacrificed personal happiness for the greater good. That choice was admirable, but it was also painful, and pretending otherwise diminishes the sacrifice involved. His final sacrifice, stepping between Ciri and Imlerith, was the culmination of countless smaller sacrifices made throughout his life. Every time he chose to train another student rather than retire, Every time he returned to Kaer Morhen, rather than seeking a more comfortable life elsewhere. Every time he put others' needs before his own desires. These accumulated choices created a pattern, a way of being in the world that made his final action inevitable. He could not have done anything else and remained himself. This is what true character means. Not isolated heroic moments, but sustained patterns of behavior that reveal fundamental values. Vesemir's character was forged over 2 centuries of daily choices, refined through experience and hardship, until it became as essential to him as breathing. When the moment came to prove who he was, there was no internal debate, no agonized decision-making. He simply did what he had always done. He protected someone who could not protect themselves, regardless of cost to himself. The stories that grew up around Vesemir after his death served multiple purposes. They entertained, certainly. They educated, passing forward lessons embedded in narrative form. But they also provided comfort to those who mourned him. By transforming his life into story, those who loved him could keep him present in some form. They could hear his voice in the tales, see his actions in the examples, feel his influence in the morals drawn from his experiences. These stories were not lies, even when they embellished or simplified complex realities. They were attempts to preserve what mattered about Vesemir in forms that could survive across generations. The literal facts of his life were important, but so were the emotional truths, the lessons, the inspiration. The stories captured these intangible elements in ways that mere historical records could not. Different people told different stories based on what aspects of Vesemir mattered most to them. Geralt's stories emphasized teaching and mentorship. Ciri's stories highlighted protection and unconditional love. Lambert's stories focused on patience and acceptance. Eskel's stories centered on professional excellence and dedication. All these versions were true because they reflected genuine facets of a complex person who meant different things to different people. The multiplicity of perspectives on Vesemir's life enriched rather than confused his legacy. It demonstrated that he was not one-dimensional, not reducible to simple categories or easy summaries. He was as complicated as anyone, full of contradictions and nuances, capable of sternness and tenderness, discipline and flexibility, tradition and innovation. The stories honored this complexity by preserving different aspects rather than forcing everything into a single narrative. As time passes and direct memory of Vesemir fades, as those who knew him personally die and are replaced by those who know only stories, his historical reality will inevitably blend with mythological embellishment. This is not tragedy, but natural transformation. Vesemir the person becomes Vesemir the symbol, representing ideals and principles larger than any individual. The symbol serves different purposes than the person did, but remains valuable in its own right. What matters is that the core truths survive this transformation. That Vesemir was dedicated, skilled, compassionate, and brave. That he maintained his principles across 2 centuries of temptation to compromise them. That he loved deeply and sacrificed willingly. That he made the world better through persistent effort rather than spectacular heroism. These truths, embedded in stories and embodied in those he influenced, ensure that Vesemir's impact extends far beyond his physical life. The question of what Vesemir would think about his legacy is interesting to consider. Given his humility and practical focus, he likely would have been uncomfortable with excessive praise or mythologizing. He saw himself as doing what needed to be done, nothing more. The idea that people would tell stories about him decades after his death might have seemed absurd or embarrassing. Yet he also understood the importance of inspiration. He knew that young witches needed examples to follow, ideals to aspire toward. If his life and death could serve those purposes, he probably would have accepted the attention as justified by its utility, not because he deserved special recognition, but because future witches deserved the best guidance available. And if his example provided that, then so be it. This utilitarian view of his own legacy fits everything else we know about Vesemir. He measured value by practical impact rather than abstract principles. If remembering him helped witches become better at their work, helped them survive longer and protect more people, then his memory had value. If stories about him inspired people to act courageously or maintain their principles under pressure, then those stories served purpose beyond mere entertainment. The cenotaph at Kaer Morhen, simple and understated, reflects this practical approach to memory. It marks the place where he fell without making grandiose claims about his importance. It acknowledges his service without demanding worship. It provides a physical location for remembrance without insisting on pilgrimage. It is exactly what Vesemir would have wanted, something functional and honest that serves its purpose without unnecessary elaboration. But beyond the stone marker, beyond the stories and the inherited mannerisms and the techniques still practiced, what truly remains of Vesemir is the space he created for others to flourish. He trained Geralt, who became the White Wolf. He mentored Ciri, who saved the world from the White Frost. He taught Eskel and Lambert and countless others who went on to protect innocence across the continent. His legacy is not primarily about him, but about what he enabled others to accomplish. This is perhaps the highest form of legacy, not being remembered for your own achievements, but being the foundation on which others built their achievements. Vesemir was the soil in which legends grew, the steady support that allowed others to reach heights he never sought for himself. He took satisfaction not from personal glory, but from seeing his students succeed, from knowing that his efforts had made their successes possible. In the end, Vesemir's story is not about a witcher who became a legend. It is about a teacher who created legends, a guardian who protected the possibility of future heroism, a bridge between past and future, who ensured that knowledge and values survived to serve coming generations. He was the last master of Kaer Morhen, but more importantly, he was the master who ensured Kaer Morhen's teachings would outlast the fortress itself. Close your eyes now, dreamer. Let the weight of these centuries settle over you like a familiar blanket. Remember that somewhere in the mountains, in a crumbling fortress warmed by fading embers, an old witcher once lived who taught legends and preserved knowledge and loved without reservation. Remember that he gave his life so that others might live, that he maintained hope when despair seemed rational, that he kept going when stopping would have been easier. Remember Vesemir. Remember the last master of Kaer Morhen. Remember that even in a world of monsters and magic, the greatest power is the choice to keep standing when everything urges you to fall, to keep caring when caring brings only pain, to keep teaching when students will inevitably surpass and then leave you behind. The path he walked was long, and often lonely. The burdens he carried were heavy and never fully set down. The losses he endured would have broken lesser souls. But he walked and carried and endured, and in doing so proved that dedication and courage and love can outlast even death itself. In the end, we all return to silence, but some of us, if we are very lucky and very dedicated, leave echoes that resonate long after we are gone. Vesemir left such echoes, and they will continue, faint but persistent, for as long as anyone remembers what it means to be a witcher, for as long as anyone understands that protecting others is worth any sacrifice, for as long as anyone believes that the world can be made better through persistent effort, even when success seems impossible. This is the tale of Vesemir. This is the chronicle of endurance. This is the story of the last master of Kaer Morhen. May we all face our endings with such courage, live our lives with such purpose, and leave behind legacies worthy of remembrance. Rest well, old master. Your watch is ended. Your students carry forward the light you kindled, and your memory, preserved in stone and story and the daily habits of those who loved you, ensures that you will never be truly gone. The path continues, and those who walk it do so with the strength you gave them, the knowledge you shared, and the example you set. In the quiet moments when the wind howls through Kaer Morhen's broken walls, some say you can still hear him. The steady rhythm of blade on whetstone, the patient correction of a student's stance, the gruff affection in a voice that pretended to be stern. These sounds are memory made manifest, echoes of a presence so strong that even death could not entirely silence it. And perhaps that is the truest measure of a life well lived. Not the monuments erected or the accolades received, but the persistent presence that lingers after the person has gone. The sense that they are still there somehow, watching over those they loved, ensuring that their work continues. Vesemir achieved this immortality not through magic or legend, but through love, dedication, and the simple refusal to stop mattering to the people whose lives he touched. So when you walk the path, dreamer, when you face your own monsters and make your own impossible choices, remember the old master. Remember that someone once maintained hope and honor and humanity through 2 centuries of darkness. Remember that he proved it was possible, that dedication could outlast despair, that love could survive loss, that teaching could transcend death. Remember Vesemir, and in remembering, keep him alive. If you enjoyed this deep exploration of Vesemir's life and legacy, please consider liking this video and subscribing to the channel for more comprehensive dives into the lore of your favorite fictional universes. Share your own memories and thoughts about Vesemir in the comments below. What lessons from his story resonate most with you? How do you think his legacy should be remembered? Let's continue this conversation together, keeping alive the memory of the old master who gave so much and asked for so little in return. Until next time, dreamer. Until we meet again in the shadows, where stories are born and legends never truly die.